You're welcome to today's webinar on best practices for data security, privacy, and compliance in background check solutions, brought to you by HRS Pro Africa in partnership with Prembly. My name is Titilokwe Salami, and I'm your host for this session. You're welcome, everyone. You're welcome to our speakers as well. So in this era where data breaches and privacy concerns are increasingly prevalent, ensuring security and privacy of personal data during background check process is very critical. So as organizations, we have a responsibility to protect legal and regulatory standards. So today we'll be exploring best practices for data security, privacy, and compliance in background check solutions with insights from industry experts. So without further ado, let's dive into the discussion. So we'll take a moment to introduce our speakers for this webinar. So we have Dr. Adebola Orogun.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Adebola Orogun. I lead data intelligence research and development at Prembly, one of the world's leading KYC, KYB companies in the world. We are big in verification, anti-money laundering, and anything that has to do with that. I've been in the academic sector for over a decade and also been in the industry for well over 9 years. And it's really awesome being here. And I do hope this section actually teaches and help spread up your understanding about background checks and everything that has to do with background checks. Thank you.
You're welcome, Dr. Orogun. Welcome to this session.
Thanks for having
me. So
me.
we have Christine Nwara. So Christine, would you mind giving us a brief introduction of yourself?
So my name is Christine Nwara. I am a professional in background checks, specifically Prembly. It's known as the top leading background screening company, also KYB, KYC. My experience is 7 years experience. So I spent my first 3 years basically doing the actual work. That is being a verifications analyst and being able to vet various corporates and various candidates. So that gave me a wealth of experience. So in addition to that, I was able now to build a team from scratch. So I've been able to lead a team of over 15 people, recruit and be able to train them and show them the actual work. I've also been able to train and show people and come up with the specific policies and regulations in the industry, and also grow with the organization. So I bring a wealth of experience having vetted all those corporates and the individuals. So I bring the value of the actual work being done. I have the ground experience. Yeah, so that's basically who I am.
Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you for that. Yeah. So each of our speakers bring a wealth of knowledge and experience in their respective fields, as you can see from their profile, and we are excited to learn from them in this session. So now let's get started with our first topic, focusing on data security measures in background check processes. So I would like to ask Christine, so how have you seen the landscape of data security and privacy evolve in the background check industry over the past few years?
Okay, so a few things. So the first thing maybe I'd like to talk about is the manual process. When background checks, we were doing the background checks when we began, the process was very manual. Majority of the data sources, including ourselves, on how we were processing this data, was a very manual process. So primarily, we conducted the checks manually, which involved paper records, and the persons doing verifications were also, it was being done manually, including the resourcing. It was manual. Means we were also going for physical site visits. We needed to physically request for these verifications. But increasingly, we have seen evolving. We've seen the involvement of coming in of the integration of data, where we're able now to be able to integrate our data or integrate our systems with other industries. Say, for example, I'll talk about the Kenyan industry. So initially, the company searches, or the what we call here in Kenya, company searches, the BRS industry, was purely a manual process. In 2021, after COVID, that process was moved to an online platform called eCitizen, where we are now able to do a search online. It's no longer a manual search. That means we can be able, having our systems as Prembly, we can be able to integrate the PRS system and be able to get time data. Another good example is the IPRS. IPRS is the mandated data source here in Kenya to provide identity verification. So we've been able also to integrate with that platform, or the government data platform, to get compliance and regulations. As we all know, in Nigeria and Kenya, especially speak about Nigeria and Kenya, the Data Privacy Act in Kenya came into effect in 2019. In Nigeria, the Data Privacy Act came into effect in 2023. So as you could see, initially there was no really compliance or regulation in country. The one that we were working with was the GDPR. So that evolution has happened. So from a place where there was no regulation or compliance policy, to a place where we have had to come up with those regulations and regulations and compliance, and even comply with the regulations that have been effected in the countries. We've also have had to also come up with our own internal data privacy policies to be able to, of course, train our staff and show them the way on how to protect data and process data, and even make sure that this data is handled in a confidential manner. So those are the major evolutions I would want to speak about. But maybe as I close, I would like to speak about one more, customer awareness. So increasingly, we can see the consumers are becoming more aware of the data privacy, and there's also greater demand in the transparency and the control of personal information. That means initially there was no match, because there was no law, or there was no really framework to operate in terms of data privacy. Now that there's a law into effect, more people are becoming aware of their rights as their data subjects. So that means we need also to be aware of these data privacy laws and acts, so that we don't infringe on the customers or the clients' rights.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine. That was really insightful. So I would like to know, Dr. Adebola, do you have would you like to add to what Christine had said?
Yeah, basically that's it. The migration from the manual way of processing data, which involves the normal paper-based processes, to the highly automated and digital platform, definitely shows there will be a need for risk management and also security and background checks, right? So, for example, the integration of AI and ML that has enabled real-time data analysis and continuous monitoring, which definitely has enhanced the reliability and the scope of background checks. It brings its own advantages, and also definitely it brings its own risks. So basically, the implementation of the policies she mentioned about, which worldwide everybody actually knew about GDPR, but now every country is coming up with its own policy. That has actually been a thing also, and it has forced organizations, it has forced different startups and organizations to ensure that they adopt stricter data security measures, such that they are able to comply with those policies to ensure that they protect personal information. So that's what I can add to what you said.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Adebola. Okay, so I would also like to ask, what are the key best practices for ensuring data security when conducting background checks?
All right, so there are two ways to actually look at this. You can look at the extrinsic way and the extrinsic way. Now, the extrinsic way is the way your organization conducts background checks. and how it aligns with the policies around, right? So you need to ensure that you comply with regulations and policies. Now, in Europe, you definitely talk about the EU GDPR. I think different countries also have their own policies. Now, before you even think of how your company does its internal background checks for customers, you need to ensure that your company is actually complying with the regulations in and around background check in the first place. Then also you need to be big on encryption, right? So either your data is at rest or it's in transit, either it's sitting in a DB or it's being sent from one place to the other. You need to make sure that if your data is intercepted, the confidentiality of your data is retained. That way you're not putting people's information, either personal or business, at risk. Also, you need to be big on MFA. You need to ensure that you are doing multi-factor authentication. Now, the world we live in right now is a dangerous one. Although people think 2FA is big, I would say MFA is better, because with 2FA, it's still easy to guess. Most companies are only big on you having a password and probably you having a text message to receive some OTPs for your checks and all. But having it being more than two is better, because if you take the factorial of 3, you're getting more than 6. So which means there are 6 different ways a hacker needs to go through before he or she can actually intercept whatever it is you're doing your background checks. So MFA is actually a good way to ensure that. And another one is to ensure that you have an hierarchical access control structure, right? You must clearly define who have access to what, right? So everyone must now have access to everything that has to do with your background check data and etc. And I'm always of the opinion that an organization is as strong as its weakest link, which is the humans, right? So as long as the organization that is doing the background check has human in the loop, you definitely need to ensure regular audit check. You need to be sure of what you're doing. You need to check you need to provide security audit all the time to identify and to mitigate vulnerabilities. So for instance, there is a company that is called Verified Credentials somewhere in Europe. They use robust access controls and 2FA to ensure that their companies are protected. Also, recently in Prembly, we implemented both of them actually. So we hybridized both of them, both a stricter hierarchical structure and also ensuring that MFA is done by all our employees, and that has really helped us in Prembly. So those are like the essential security measures you can take when doing background check processes.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a very good answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Debola. So I would like to ask Christine, what are the essential security measures that background check providers should implement to protect sensitive personal information?
Okay, so in terms of being able to provide a better security for our clients, so among the things that we make sure is we have a consent for all the candidates or clients that we are conducting background checks on. So any candidate or any client that requests for us to conduct a background check on, we have to have a consent from the candidate or the client for that matter. I think the other thing is what Dr. Debola has talked about, the staff. So we should be able to conduct regular trainings and even educate our staff on the current regulations and the policies. So we actually even did recently, we conducted a recent data privacy protection training for all our staff. So that means the staff is aware of what risks are there, what are the for example, the implications of data breach, and what are the things that they should look out for in terms of data privacy. The other thing I think is compliance with the legal and the regulatory requirements. So in Kenya, we are since we have the Data Protection Act, we are supposed to have or comply with that act by registering with the ODPC. So ODPC stands for the Office of the Data Protection Act here in Kenya. So when we do that, we are supposed to get a certificate. So we're supposed to have all these things. They're supposed to come in the Office of the Data Protection Act office. The ODPC, that is the Data Commissioner, is supposed to come and audit our firm, which has already been done. And then from there, we get a certificate just to show that we are actually compliant with the Data Privacy Act. So those are the things that we have actually implemented, or those are the things that a company should do to ensure that we are compliant with the regulations.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that. Okay, so I would like to ask Dr. Adebola, what are some of the most common data security threats in background check solutions, and how can organizations address them?
All right. So thank you. Again, I would like to start from the company check, the within the company threat, which we call insider threat. Yeah. So basically, this is actually the least talk about threats. And when you talk about background checks or anything that has to do with data threats, people actually focus a bit more on the external threat than the insider threat. So there is this risk that is posed by individuals that are even within the organization themselves, who have access to sensitive information, right? So for instance, you have an employee who is actually, I don't know, probably lackadaisical or not careful enough, and this person has access to people's data, then you definitely know you are at risk. Also, there are some internet attacks that can happen due to competition. So for instance, I'm going to use two companies, for instance, Pepsi and Coca-Cola. So basically, Pepsi wants to be like Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola wants to always remain Coca-Cola, but Pepsi employs somebody, make sure they plant them in Coca-Cola, and the person has access to Coca-Cola's secret ingredient data and exposes it to Pepsi. So that is like the metaphorical example of what you can call a typical internet threat. Also, we have phishing attacks. That's a really common one. Phishing attacks are just malicious attempts to gain access to sensitive information, either by pretending to be a trustworthy entity or to pretend to be one of those top people in the company. So to mitigate this, I didn't talk about mitigating insider threat. I'll talk about that. To mitigate phishing attack, you need to make sure you train your employees to recognize what phishing attempts are, and also ensure that you implement email security measures to mitigate this. Microsoft has something called Barracuda that tries as much as possible to quarantine emails that are not allowed on an organization's IP, but definitely, fraudsters try to also evolve. So the human part of this is actually big. You need to train your employees to ensure that they are careful, right? I was given an example 2 weeks ago in a seminar in Coventry, and I wrote Amazon.com with the normal A alphabet and Amazon.com with a Greek A alphabet. They are two different things. But if an employee or if someone is not careful, you can fall victim of that. And the last one I will discuss is just the data breaches. Yeah. So unauthorized access to sensitive data. This is a big one. It happens all the time. Background check is a sensitive part of an organization. If you are running background check, you definitely know you have access to people's data in mass. And the fact that you have access to people's sensitive data, not just personal data anymore, sensitive data, means you need to curb data breach, because if a data breach happens, then definitely you're not only putting your company at the forefront of harm, you're also putting that particular person or those people whose data you have at the forefront of harm. So you need to ensure you curb unauthorized access to personal data. Is fine. You can know my name. You can do whatever it is you want with my name. You can even have my phone number. That's fine. But there are some sensitive data that needs to remain with just some set of people without it being breached. Now, if it's breached, it's crazy. Now, one way you can actually try to curb this is to ensure that you address the implementation of encryption. And like I said earlier, you make sure you have strong access control in place. And periodically, like I said earlier, to conduct audits on your data. A lot of companies actually take that audit on data lightly because you just feel, oh, people don't have access to it. We have MFA on board. We ensure that only some people have access to it. But if you do constant auditing on your data and the people that have access to your data, you are going a long way to curb data breaches. So those are like the common security threats and background checks, and those are the low-hanging fruits of how you can solve those threats.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Adibola. So speaking of data bridging and encryption, can you give us more detail on the importance of encryption in protecting sensitive data during background checks?
Oh yeah, is this for me or Joy? Me?
Yes. Yeah. So that you can giving us more insight here.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So when I was little, there is a way we communicate as kids. So I'm a Yoruba person, but there is this language that whenever myself and my brother want to discuss, we speak the language, and my parents keep looking at us like, what are you guys saying? So basically, there was a particular time we wanted to, quote and unquote, go and eat the food mommy told us not to touch. So we're speaking in one crazy language like that, and it was steganograph, so they didn't hear. Now that is layman encryption, and encryption is really simple. You are steganographing a message such that only the sender and the receiver understands it, and you need a decryption key for you to understand the language. One quick way to think about it is if you were living in the era where we're using flip phones and we're using keypad phones, you will notice that on the alphabet 2 you have ABC. So I can definitely give you numerical encryption of my password with nobody knowing that is my password. So with encryption, you are ensuring that what you are sending out or what is resident on your DB, your data address, has enough protection to ensure that if anyone, you can be looking at it, but you won't know what you're looking at. It's just like you picking up a keyboard. You definitely know on your keyboard, all the letters on your keyboard have ASCII representations here, which are binary for sure. So imagine I want to spell Adibola for you, and I'm spelling it in binary, and you're saying 1001110001111 strings of binary. You might just be looking at it like this. You're seeing it, you have access to it, but you are unable to decode what the message of that particular thing is. So that is why being big on encryption is cool in background check. You can't just take it for granted that anyone cannot intercept your message. But when you encrypt it and they intercept it, they see something, but they don't understand what they're looking at. So unless the person who is the receiver has the decryption code, either a rec code or whatever code, whoever intercepts that data, the data is useless for him or her. So that is one big reason why encryption is cool. And there are a lot of standards for encryption. I spoke about REC the other time. There are, I think there is this other one that is being implemented now, IFP. I've forgotten the company that started it, but a lot of standards for encryption, and this is actually a big one that industries who are into background check must start looking into.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adibola. So, Christine, so I would like to ask, how can organizations ensure that their third-party background check providers implement adequate security measures? Because most of the time, these organizations, they don't have an idea what the whole process is, and they need to be sure that these third-party background check providers, they've done the necessary things that need to be done concerning protecting data. So how would such organizations convince how would organizations be convinced by the third party that these strategies are being implemented in the way they should?
Okay, so if I get you right, you're asking how do we make sure that the companies, the third parties, that the background check companies or our service providers that we engage with, they are compliant with the data security measures. Okay, so one of the most important things that a company can do, or I'll give a practical example of how Prembly goes about ensuring that we are dealing with a company that is adherent to data security. measures. So one of the things is making sure that we have done our due diligence. We conduct a very thorough due diligence. So of course, being a background checks company, you expect us that we will do a background check on your company. If you're bringing us or any data, or we want to partner with you in any form. So we make sure that you are compliant with, of course, the GDPR if you are within the European country. If not, then we also make sure that you are compliant within the laws of the country that you are located in. So once we do that, we of course make sure that you have the certificates that are required, because you could say yes, you're compliant, but what is the evidence of you being compliant with those laws? Then the other thing is, of course, we make sure that we have performed a risk assessment. So if you have a system, if you tell us, for example, you have a system, we will want to do audits on that system. We will want to see how safe or how secure is your system for us to be able to integrate with your system, for example. So if you're providing data and you're telling us you have a system, for example, and you would want to provide that data by integrating with us, we will definitely want to do an audit on the system. So security audits, and we will involve our IT persons to be able to do those security audits, and it will be a very thorough audit. Then the other thing is we do a review of data handling practices. So we would want to know. So as a third party who we are dealing with, or as a data processor or a data controller, how are you processing? What are your best practices as an organization? Do you have a data policy in your organization? We would want to see that. If you can provide that, then you can be able to say, okay, you're good to go. Do you have access controls, for example? Are your systems, for example, having a multi-factor authentication, the two-factor authentication, or the multiple-factor authentication, or is it a risk to any security threat? Then the other thing is we make sure that you have trained your staff to be able to handle our data. It's not just anybody who is handled our staff. So we would want to see what kind of trainings have your staff undergone. Are they qualified staff to be able to handle our data? I think those are the major things that we do or we conduct to making sure, or as a company, we'll be able essentially do to make sure that you have been able, or we are compliant. Because if you're not compliant as a third party who is supplying us with the data, then by default, we also are not compliant.
Thank you so much, Christine. Okay, so I would like to ask you again, Christine. So what are the key privacy concerns associated with conducting background checks, particularly in regions with strict data protection laws?
Mm-hmm. A very good question, and thank you for that question. So the first thing that I would want to talk about is, of course, informed consent. So as you know, in this industry, in background checks, the most important thing is a consent. And when I say consent, I mean it has to be direct consent. It cannot be an indirect consent or implied consent. It has to be a direct consent and an informed consent, meaning I need to know what am I consenting to as a data subject. Data subject is anybody, could be me, anyone who has data. If I have an ID, if I have any data that pertains to me, I'm a data subject. So it has to be informed consent. So what one of the challenges is organizations must obtain explicit consent from individuals before collecting this data. Sometimes these people are not maybe very well educated. So if these people are, they come from regions where there's a very strict data protection laws. Say, for example, they're not very well educated, so that means they don't know what they're signing to. So it's our mandate as a data processor company or a company that is dealing with data to make sure that these people have information, or they know what is it that they're consenting to. It's not just about consenting. They need to be aware that the information that I am going to release or that is going to be processed or I'm going to share is actually information that I am comfortable sharing. So as Dr. Debola was speaking about, in data, there's usually what we call data, just the normal data, where we call personal data, but there's also what we call personal private data. So personal data, private personal data. So this is data that is very personal. It's actually the word is personal sensitive data. So that data is data that is actually, it could be data like, for example, let me give you an example of personal sensitive data. It could be your religion. So for example, if I give out my religion or my political affiliation, I could be alienated or I could be victimized. So that's very sensitive data. And if they are releasing that information, they need to know how we're protecting that data in terms of not exposing it. And maybe, for example, what is the duration of us maintaining that data, and what is the reason for that collection of that data? Because once you collect data as a background checks company, we also need to process that data up to a level where the client or the candidate has agreed. They need to be aware, what is this data being used for? And if we go beyond that, in terms of if we process that data beyond what they had consented to, that becomes a problem. The other thing in terms of processing data in regions where data protections are very, very strict is data accuracy and quality. So sometimes these people may hide the information that or it's not up to date. For example, it could be, and let me give an example of a CV. If I've been employed, for example, in a company for so long, say maybe 5 years, I don't need to keep updating my CV. So if I ask you for your CV to be able to do a background check, it might not be updated. So the question is, am I processing or am I looking at the right data in that manner? So the challenge of data accuracy and quality also comes into play. Then the question of course of data retention. So data retention periods vary from country to country. The data retention policy in Kenya is 7 years. In another country, for example, it could be actually in the data retention policy in Kenya is not actually defined, but in the Data Protection Act in Nigeria, it's actually defined to 7 years. That means when there's a cross functional or cross sharing of data in countries, that becomes an issue. So the question is now, how do I process this data to a point where it respects the rights of this data subject? The other thing I probably might want to wind up with is the data minimization. So the relevance and the necessity of this data. So only data that is relevant and necessary to background check should be collected. So when we collect sensitive or irrelevant information, it can raise privacy concerns. So if, for example, I'm asking your what is it called, your CV, I shouldn't ask any further information, like, for example, your marital status or even your sex, your gender. That information is not necessary or is not vital for me to process your background check in the case where I'm doing an employment background check for you for employment purposes.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was really detailed. Dr. Adebola, how can organizations balance the need for thorough background checks with the obligation to protect candidates' privacy?
Okay, that's a good one. Balancing a thorough background check and also ensuring that you are complying with your obligation to protect the privacy of your client. Yeah, that's a question, right?
Yes.
So basically, yeah. Anything that has to do with background check, one way or the other, exposes a client to the company that is performing the check. But the one thing that is standing out is the fact that who are the companies or who are the clients, the company that is providing the check, interacting with. So, for instance, in Prembly, before we conduct any background check for you, we make sure that you, like Christian said, you have the licenses of what is required. So you can't just be a company approaching us, telling us we need to find information about XYZ without giving us the proper document that shows that you have the right to do that. Also, the fact that a company or a customer wants you to provide background check on someone doesn't mean they need to have all of the person's data. Now, what kind of data do you need and why do you need them? You need to be able to state explicitly the kind of data you want. You are a financial institution and you need, like Kristen said, you need the religious data about someone or the religion data about someone? What do you need it for? Right? So the kind of data you need, why you need them, when you need them, how you need them, this is how you can actually, answering all of this is how you can actually make a balance between, okay, fine, what am I giving you to ensure that I'm trying to protect the integrity and the privacy concerns of the users, and also ensuring that I'm doing something thorough for you. So the fact that a company who is a background check company have access to everyone's data doesn't mean you need to give everyone's data to anyone that has. There must be a reason, there must be a permit. It's just like you say you want to arrest someone without having a warrant. So why are you using the data? What is the kind of data you require? Right? So, for instance, if you want to check Adebola or Ogunwa, you need to just know where I live. That way, you don't need my religious, you don't need my bank account statement, you don't need much than my name, address, phone number. So there must be a predefined reason of you wanting the data. Also, there must be a set out rule that states what kind of data you get for what kind of purpose. Now, if you are able to just sew all of this together, I think you will definitely have a balance between doing a thorough background check and also ensuring the privacy of your company.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adebola. So I would also like to direct this question to you. Could you share some best practices for informing candidates about the data collection and usage during background checks process? Because we have some candidates that are actually quite headstrong when it comes to things like this. They are not ready to comply because they feel like they're letting too much out already.
We've actually had very interesting experiences, and maybe I can give you those experiences. Maybe I can just talk about one. So we had this company that had assigned us or given us an assignment to do residence verifications. As you know, address or residence verifications is whereby we actually go physically to conduct or confirm that actually this person resides there. So an organization has given us that authority, the HR has consented to it, but the question now, had they given the candidates there the full knowledge or the reason why they needed this check to happen? Now, what happened is, when we were contacting, because at some point we need to involve the candidate. If you, for example, reside in an area, we need to involve you in one way or the other, probably make a phone call to you, write you an email just to ask you give us the very specifics of where your residence is located. So these candidates of this, I want to name the organization, came back to us with a very unpleasant email, and they were saying, we don't understand why you would be you would be coming to my home, because again, this is very personal to them. You're coming to their home, and how we conduct this background check, we normally take photos of that of their home, of course not inside, just on the outside, just to give evidence to our client that we've actually visited. So the candidates who we were conducting these checks were very furious, and they were wondering, this is very personal to me, it's my home, who are you to come to my home and even take images? So of course, where the challenge here came is there was lack of communication on the why. Just like Dr. Adebola was saying, you're collecting information, but why are you collecting? So I believe if there was sufficient information provided as to the why that information was being collected in the first place and how that information was going to be used, then I don't think this challenge would come into play. So maybe the thing that I would probably want to add in terms of how we balance that, in terms of just making sure that we have a thorough background check, but also complying and making sure that the candidates, they feel that we have complied as well, but we're also protecting the candidate. So the one thing that I'd like to talk about is I don't know, I'm losing my trail of thought, but it's adherence, or rather the ensuring, it's come to mind again, ensuring transparency. So transparency, for me, when I think about transparency, two things come to mind. So one, clear communication, just like in the example that I've given as I was speaking. If we had given the candidates the HR in this case had given the candidates provided clear and transparent information about the background check process, I don't believe the candidate would have come back with a backlash, email, not happy about the process, because the essence of us doing the background check is not to infringe on the candidate's rights. It's more or less to provide information that would assist this particular organization to be able to employ this person or have a risk management plan. The thing when I talk about transparency that comes to mind is access to information. So I don't know whether you are aware in this platform that as a data subject, you have the right to access your own background check report. So we've also had scenarios where we've done a background check. Maybe the information that was provided was not pleasant to the candidate. They're not too happy with the information that was provided, and to them that information seems as false information. So the candidate or the data subject in this case who signed the consent form, they have a right to come back to us and say, I need my background check report to see what details was provided and the mechanism to which they dispute to correct those inaccuracies. So maybe an institution said, for example, academic institution, we sent an email and the academic certificate, and they said that academic certificate was forged. Again, when we are conducting background checks, we deal with the aspect of the human, the human aspect, and sometimes this as a human being, we normally make errors. So sometimes the person or the academic registrar could send maybe wrong information. They could say maybe an academic certificate was forged, but it's not forged. So if the candidate sends back a dispute, then we need to ensure that we implement the right measures to correct these inaccuracies and even go to the extent of even making sure that this institution sends in an apology. So those are the balances. So making sure that we are very transparent in our information by giving clear communication, having that information accessible to the candidate if and as when they need, because at the end of the day, that is their information. I think the last thing that I would want to maybe talk about in terms of balancing that is adherence to the legal and regulation requirements. So we also need to understand. So remember at the onset, I talked about the training for our staff. We need to know what are the laws and the regulations we need to adhere to. So if we have not complied with, for example, the Data Privacy Act, we don't have an internal policy, then there could be easily data breach in the organization. So that means a candidate's information could be exposed. Maybe I can give a layman's example where, for example, if I'm doing a background check and I've employed a staff to do this background check, then for some reason I want to dismiss this candidate or the employee from the employment. Maybe they have a disciplinary, or for whatever reason we want to relieve this candidate of the staff of their duties. As a revenge mechanism, they would want, for example, to maybe post the information on social media about a candidate they did a background check. So of course, these are the things that we need to look at and maybe see the measures that we need to implement as an organization. And among the things we've done, of course, in making sure that the information that we have the data that is provided to us is only accessible on certain platforms, on OneDrive, on your email and on your work email alone. You only have that access to the data, the data that is provided by candidates only on your work laptop. You cannot access that information at home. So those are among the security measures that we've been able to implement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. So for Dr. Adebola, I would like to ask, what are some of the most critical regulatory requirements that organizations must comply with when conducting background checks?
All right. So basically, you need to. The first one is actually on regulations. That's like the biggest one. Regulations. Because if you fail to comply with the regulations, say for instance GDPR in Europe, if you're providing a background check for anyone who lives in Europe or for a company about someone who lives in Europe and you fail some part of GDPR, there's an hefty fine of 20 million euros. which is huge. So the regulations is the first thing you need to ensure you comply with, and also you need to ensure that the consent, right? So if, as Adebola as I am, you want to perform a background check on me and you don't have my consent, you don't have a written consent of me, then I can sue you. So basically, off the shelf, I think it has to do with regulations. You have to make sure that what you're doing as background check company follows the rules and regulation of that particular forum. If, for instance, you go to Cuba, you try to do a background check on Cuba or someone in Cuba where your country doesn't have extradition law, then you are going against the law of the land, and your company might actually face the wrath of the law for that. So also you need to understand the legal and ethical responsibilities of what you're doing as background check. That is something you must ensure. And you need to also be aware of the security protocols, right? So what are the security protocols of what you're doing? You need to make emphasis on data protections. So those are like the off-the-shelf things that are coming to my head for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Adebola. So I would like to ask Christine, so how do different regions compliance standards such as GDPR in Europe or COPIA in South Africa impact the background check process?
Okay, so for the different compliance and regulations, maybe I can just speak about Kenya and Nigeria for now.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
So for us, like I said, the first thing that comes to mind for me is if you're, for example, in Kenya and you're dealing with data. Let me just say that if you're in Kenya and you're dealing with any kind of data, you need to first of all register with the data the ODPC, which is the Office of the Data Protection Office in Kenya. So those are one of the things that you can make sure that we do. Then of course, being in Kenya, we need to of course adhere to the GDPR because we are within the European jurisdiction where we are compliant with the GDPR. So any company or any organization or any data processor, any partner that we deal with that is within the European jurisdiction, they need to comply with the GDPR, even if they don't have their own data policy acting in Kenya, in their own country. So they need to adhere to those laws. I think the other thing is data protection, consent and data collection. So explicit consent is mandatory. So I explained that earlier by saying that we need to a candidate who is we are doing a background check needs to give explicit consent, not indirect consent, not implied consent, meaning that a HR for example cannot sign for a candidate. They cannot say that on behalf of this candidate or candidate X, I have approved for you to be able to conduct background checks. That can't happen. It has to be a candidate giving their own explicit consent. I think then when we deal with cross functional data, where data is moved from one country to the other, we also need to look at those policies. Are we adherent to those policies within those countries? So if it's Kenya and Nigeria, we need to look at the laws and the policies that exist within those two jurisdictions.
Can you provide examples of penalties or let's say of some consequences that organization might face if they fail to comply with some of these regulations?
So among the things, of course, that could happen if you don't comply is one. Let me maybe classify them: criminal liability. So individuals or organizations that do not, for example, comply with the Data Privacy Act or the GDPR could lead to them, for example, the heavy penalties being given to them, or even imprisonment, particularly in cases where there is severe data breach of repeated violations. The other thing is reputation damage. So if an organization, for example, we breach data privacy, or for example, we don't adhere to the data privacy or for some reason there's exposure of someone's personal data, it could lead to a reputation damage. It means that as an organization, then we cannot be able to get business, or rather we cannot be able to sell our product. So it's important for us to be compliant and making sure that, at the end of the day, we have measures to make sure that even our own staff and our own employees who are dealing with this data do not expose this data, and they don't engage in data breach. The other thing is operational restrictions. So this means that sometimes if the data protection commissioner has the authority, comes and does audits in the organization and realizes that you are not compliant, they have the authority to impose restrictions or bans, and even making sure that you have closed down your organizations, your organization, and you're not able to process data any further. Then also there's also revocation of the registration. So I said earlier on that in Kenya, being a data processor in Kenya, we are required to register with the ODPC. So if we are caught with the data breach and maybe repeated the data breach, then it could lead to us being our certificate being revoked. So of course that's to our disadvantage. Those are the things that comes top of my mind, of the things that could, or the penalties that could come into play if we don't adhere to the data privacy.
Okay, thank you so much, Crystal. So, Dr. Adebola, thank you so much for this session, for joining us, and we hope to have you again some other time in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Titi, and thank you, everyone.